The wind howled through the skeletal trees, their bare branches clawing at the night sky like desperate fingers. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, pothole-ridden road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. The GPS had stopped working about 20 minutes ago, and I was relying on the handwritten directions the Airbnb host had sent me. The directions were vague, to say the least. Turn left at the old oak tree, drive past the abandoned barn, and look for the mailbox with the broken hinge. It felt like I was in a horror movie, and I was the clueless protagonist who ignored all the warning signs. But I didn't have a choice. I needed a place to stay, and this was the only affordable option within 100 miles. My budget was tight, and the photos of the cabin had looked charming enough. Rustic, secluded, and surrounded by nature. Perfect for a little peace and quiet, or so I thought. When I finally spotted the mailbox, its rusted metal barely hanging on by a single screw, I let out a sigh of relief. The cabin was just a short drive down a dirt path, and as I pulled up, I could see it silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was smaller than I'd imagined, with a sagging roof and a porch that looked like it might collapse under the weight of a strong breeze. But it was mine for the weekend, and right now, that was all that mattered. I grabbed my suitcase and made my way to the front door, the wooden steps creaking ominously under my feet. The key was supposed to be under the mat, and sure enough, it was there, cold and slightly rusted. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the musty smell of old wood and damp earth. The interior was dimly lit by a single overhead light, and I quickly found the switch to turn on a few more lamps. The space was cozy, if a bit run down, with a small kitchenette, a worn-out couch, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom, and I decided to explore those later. For now, I just wanted to settle in. I dropped my suitcase by the couch and started unpacking the groceries I'd brought with me. The nearest town was over an hour away, and I didn't feel like making the trip back if I ran out of food. As I put the groceries away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. The isolation was getting to me already, but as the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made my heart race. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but when I looked out the window, there was no one there, just the endless expanse of trees, their shadows dancing in the moonlight. I decided to call it an early night and retreated to the bedroom. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I was exhausted from the long drive. I turned off the lights and lay down, pulling the covers up to my chin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind or the distant hoot of an owl. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, soft and melodic, but with an edge of something unnatural. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was coming from the hallway. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained dark. The battery was dead, even though I was sure I'd charged it before leaving. Panic began to set in, as I realized how isolated I truly was. I got out of bed and crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The whispering was right on the other side, so close that I could almost feel the breath of whoever, or whatever, was out there. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, as I debated whether to open it. Before I could make a decision, the knob began to turn on its own. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, as the door slowly creaked open. The hallway was pitch black, but I could feel a presence there, watching me. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen in place. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce straight through me. It took a step forward, and I finally found my voice, letting out a blood-curdling scream. The figure lunged at me, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the bedroom, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. My body ached, and my head felt like it had been stuffed with cotton. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a product of my overactive imagination. But then I noticed the scratches on the floor, deep gouges that hadn't been there before, and on the wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "You shouldn't have come." I packed my things as quickly as I could, and fled the cabin, not bothering to lock the door behind me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out who or what had been there with me that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that whispering again, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. It was a quiet, uneventful night at the rural gas station where I worked the overnight shift. The kind of night where the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, and the occasional flicker of the sign outside was the only movement. The station was located on the edge of a small town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The kind of woods that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you knew there was no one around. I had been working at the gas station for about 6 months, and the overnight shift was my favorite. It was peaceful, and I liked the solitude. I could read, listen to music, or just sit and think without any interruptions. But tonight, something felt off. The air was heavy, and the usual sounds of the night, the crickets, the rustling of leaves, were absent. It was as if the world had gone silent, holding its breath. I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, when I heard it, a faint tapping on the glass of the front door. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, and the only light came from the flickering sign and the dim glow of the moon. I shook it off, thinking it was just my imagination, and went back to my magazine. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I stood up and walked to the door, peering out into the darkness. Still, there was no one there. I unlocked the door and stepped outside, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. The woods loomed in the distance, their shadows stretching toward the station like long, grasping fingers. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. I walked around the building, checking the pumps and the dumpster area, but everything was as it should be. I was about to go back inside when I heard a rustling sound coming from the edge of the woods. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and thin, with long spindly limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I froze, unable to move, as the figure took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and it made no sound as it moved closer. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, and I could see its face now. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its long fingers reaching out to grab me. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, and ran back to the station, slamming the door shut behind me, and locking it. I leaned against the door, my heart racing, and tried to catch my breath. I looked out the window, but the figure was gone. The woods were silent once again, and the parking lot was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been spooked by the isolation and the eerie silence. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every sound, and constantly checking the windows. The figure didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hours dragged on, and by the time my shift ended, I was exhausted. I clocked out and headed to my car, my eyes darting around the parking lot as I walked. I got in and locked the doors, feeling a little safer now that I was inside. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, heading down the deserted road that led back to town. As I drove, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I still felt like I was being followed. I turned on the radio, hoping the music would calm my nerves, but it only made the silence of the night feel more oppressive. I was about halfway home when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, its pale face illuminated by my headlights. It was the same figure from the gas station, its hollow eyes staring straight at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I looked again, it was gone. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my eyes constantly scanning the road and the woods on either side. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I got out of the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I went straight to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its twisted smile and glowing eyes. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had seen and what it could mean. The next night, I was back at the gas station, my nerves still on edge. I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, that I had just been spooked by the isolation and the eerie silence. But as the hours passed, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Around midnight, I heard the tapping again. This time it was coming from the side of the building. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest. I rounded the corner and shone the light into the darkness, but there was nothing there. I was about to go back inside when I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from the woods. "Come closer," it said, sending a chill down my spine. I turned and saw the figure standing at the edge of the tree line, its hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. The figure tilted its head to the side, its grotesque smile widening. "You can't escape," it said, its voice echoing in the stillness. "I will always be watching." I ran back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I grabbed the phone and dialed the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. When the dispatcher answered, I stammered out my story, my voice breaking with fear. The police arrived a few minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. I told them everything, from the tapping on the door to the figure in the woods. They searched the area, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there.
They told me it was probably just a prank, some kids trying to scare me. But I knew better. I had seen the figure, heard its voice. It wasn't a prank, it was something else, something far more sinister. The police left, and I was alone again. I spent the rest of the night, huddled behind the counter, my eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. The figure didn't return, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the woods. When my shift ended, I left the gas station and never looked back. I quit my job that same day, unable to face another night in that place. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I step outside at night, I feel those hollow eyes on me, waiting, watching. I don't know what the figure was, or what it wanted, but I do know this: it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And I can't help but wonder if it will come for me again. The end.
It was a warm summer evening in Texas, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the endless stretches of highway. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road lulling me into a sense of calm. My destination was a small town just outside of Austin, where I was supposed to meet an old friend for a weekend getaway. But as the miles rolled by, I realized I had missed my exit. The GPS on my phone had been acting up, and by the time I noticed, I was already miles off course. I took the next exit, hoping to find a gas station or a place to turn around. The exit led me onto a narrow, two-lane road that seemed to stretch on forever, flanked by dense woods on either side. The sun was setting now, and the shadows grew longer, darker. The road was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. I felt a pang of unease, but brushed it off, telling myself I'd find a way back to the highway soon enough. After about 10 minutes of driving, I came across a small rundown gas station. The sign was faded, the paint peeling, and the lights inside flickered weakly. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, relieved to see at least one other car parked near the pumps. As I stepped out of my car, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The cicadas buzzed loudly in the trees, their rhythmic hum the only sound breaking the silence. I walked into the gas station, the bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was dimly lit, the shelves stocked with dusty cans and old snacks. A man stood behind the counter, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn-out baseball cap. He didn't look up as I entered, his attention focused on a small TV, playing static in the corner. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound friendly. "I think I'm lost. Can you tell me how to get back to the highway?" The man didn't respond at first, his eyes still glued to the TV. Then slowly, he turned to look at me. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "Highway's that way," he said, pointing vaguely toward the door. "But you don't want to go there now." "Not at night," I frowned, confused. "Why not?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Things happen on that road, after dark. Bad things. You're better off staying here till morning." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking or serious. "I'll be fine. I just need to get back on track." The man shrugged, his smile fading. "Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." I bought a bottle of water and a bag of chips, trying to shake off the strange encounter. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the other vehicle in the parking lot was gone. I hadn't seen anyone leave, but I figured they must have slipped out while I was inside. I got back on the road, the man's warning echoing in my mind. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a dark canopy overhead. The road was empty, and the only sound was the hum of my tires on the pavement. I glanced at my phone, but the signal was gone. The GPS was useless now. After a few miles, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror,
At first I was relieved to see another car, but as the minutes passed, the headlights stayed with me, never gaining or falling behind. I slowed down, hoping the car would pass, but it matched my speed. I sped up, and so did it. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that the driver was probably heading the same way, but the unease from the gas station crept back, stronger this time. I took a random turn onto a smaller road, hoping to lose them. The headlights followed. I turned again and again, each time taking narrower, more desolate roads. The headlights stayed with me, always the same distance behind. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Finally I saw a sign for a small town up ahead. Relief washed over me as I sped toward it, hoping to find help or at least a place to hide. But as I entered the town, I realized something was wrong. The streets were empty, the houses dark, not a single light was on, not a single person in sight. I pulled into a parking lot, my heart pounding. The headlights behind me stopped at the edge of town, the car idling in the shadows. I turned off my engine, trying to think of what to do. My phone still had no signal, and I had no idea where I was. Then I saw movement in the rearview mirror. The car behind me was slowly creeping forward, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I started my engine again, ready to drive off, but the car suddenly sped up, closing the distance between us in seconds. I slammed on the gas, my tires screeching as I shot out of the parking lot. The car followed, its headlights blinding in my mirror. I swerved through the empty streets, trying to lose them, but they stayed right on my tail. I turned down an alley, hoping to shake them, but the alley ended in a dead end. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. The other car pulled up behind me, blocking my exit. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. I couldn't see their face, just a silhouette against the headlights. They walked slowly toward my car, their footsteps echoing in the silence. I fumbled with the door handle, trying to unlock it, but my hands were shaking too much. The figure reached my window and tapped on the glass. I froze, too terrified to move. Then they leaned down, and I saw their face. It was the man from the gas station. He smiled that same unsettling smile, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "I told you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed till morning." I screamed, slamming my hand on the horn. The sound was deafening in the empty town. The man stepped back, startled, and I took the chance to throw the car into reverse. I hit the gas, my car lurching backward. The man jumped out of the way as I crashed into the car behind me, the impact jarring but not enough to stop me. I spun the wheel, my tires screeching as I turned the car around. The man was running toward me now, but I didn't wait to see what he would do. I sped out of the alley, back onto the empty streets. The other car was still there, but I didn't stop. I drove as fast as I could, my heart racing, my hands gripping the wheel. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the highway in the distance. As I merged onto the familiar road, I finally let myself breathe. The other car was gone, the town far behind me. I didn't know what had just happened, or why, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never take a wrong exit in Texas again.
It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of highway, the kind of night where the darkness feels alive, pressing in on you from all sides, and the only sound is the hum of your car's engine. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy, my body begging for rest. The GPS on my phone had lost signal miles back, and I was relying on memory and the occasional road sign to guide me. That's when I saw it, a flickering neon sign in the distance, barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in. The sign read, "Maggie's Diner," Open 24 hours. I didn't think twice. My stomach growled at the thought of hot coffee and a greasy burger. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching loudly in the silence. The diner was a small weathered building with a faded red roof and windows that were fogged up from the inside. A single flickering light above the door cast an eerie glow over the entrance. I parked my car, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the cold night air. The diner was empty when I walked in. The bell above the door jingled, announcing my arrival, but no one looked up. The place was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of a jukebox in the corner, playing an old country song I didn't recognize. The air smelled of stale coffee and fried food, and the vinyl booths were cracked and worn. I chose a seat at the counter where I could see the entire diner. The place felt frozen in time, like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. A waitress appeared from the kitchen, her name tag reading Maggie. She was older, with graying hair pulled back into a tight bun and a tired smile. Her uniform was a faded pink dress with a white apron, and she moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had been on her feet for too long. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm. I ordered a coffee and a cheeseburger, and she nodded before disappearing back into the kitchen. As I waited, I glanced around the diner. The walls were covered in old photographs and memorabilia, black and white pictures of people I didn't recognize, vintage license plates, and a dusty clock that had stopped at 3:15. The jukebox continued to play, the music faint and distorted, as if the record was warped. My coffee arrived first, and I took a sip, savoring the warmth. It was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. Maggie lingered for a moment, wiping down the counter with a rag that looked like it had seen better days. "Quiet night," I remarked, trying to make conversation. She nodded, her eyes darting to the door, as if expecting someone. "Yeah, it's always quiet this time of night. Most folks don't stop by until the sun comes up." I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too tired to read into her words, but as I sat there, sipping my coffee, I began to notice little things that didn't add up. The jukebox kept playing the same song over and over, even though I hadn't seen anyone touch it. The clock on the wall remained stuck at 3:15, its hands unmoving, and the fog outside seemed to grow thicker, pressing against the windows like it was trying to get in. My burger arrived, and I dug in, grateful for the distraction, but as I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around the diner again, but it was still empty. The only sound was the jukebox and the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen. That's when I saw him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure sitting in one of the booths. He was tall and thin, with a pale, gaunt face and dark circles under his eyes. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it had been tailored in another era, and he was staring straight at me. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away, hoping he wouldn't notice that I'd seen him. But when I glanced back, he was gone. I shook my head, chalking it up to my exhaustion. I must have imagined it, but as I turned back to my food, I felt a cold breeze brush against the back of my neck. The door hadn't opened, and the windows were shut tight. I spun around in my seat, but the diner was still empty. "Everything okay, hon?" Maggie asked, appearing suddenly at my side. I nodded, trying to hide my unease. "Yeah, just thought I saw something." She gave me a knowing look, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This place has a way of playing tricks on you," she said cryptically before walking away. I finished my meal quickly, suddenly eager to leave. But as I reached for my wallet, I noticed something strange. The jukebox had stopped playing, and the silence was deafening. The fog outside seemed to have seeped into the diner,
curling around the edges of the room, like tendrils of smoke. And then I saw him again, the man in the suit. He was standing by the door, his back to me, his head tilted as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call out to Maggie, but my voice caught in my throat. The man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. His face was expressionless, but there was something in his gaze that made my blood run cold. He took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed away, nearly knocking over my stool. "Maggie," I finally managed to shout, my voice trembling. She emerged from the kitchen, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. "What's wrong, hun?" I pointed to the man, but when I looked back, he was gone again. The diner was empty, the fog receding as if it had never been there. Maggie followed my gaze, then shook her head. "You've been driving too long," she said gently. "Why don't you stay a while? Rest up before you hit the road again." I wanted to argue, to tell her what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief, as she led me to a booth in the corner. She brought me another cup of coffee and a slice of pie, and I sat there, staring out the window at the foggy night. As the hours passed, the diner remained quiet. Maggie busied herself with cleaning, humming softly to herself. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it lingered like a shadow. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to break through the fog, I saw him one last time. The man in the suit was standing outside the diner, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I screamed, scrambling out of the booth and backing away. Maggie rushed over, her face pale. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pointed to the window, but when I looked again, he was gone. The fog had lifted, and the parking lot was empty. My car sat where I'd left it, the only sign that I hadn't imagined the entire night. Maggie placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch surprisingly warm. "You should go," she said softly, "before he comes back." I didn't need to be told twice. I threw some money on the counter and bolted out the door, my heart racing. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The diner was still there, but the neon sign was dark, and the building looked abandoned, as if it had been for years. I never went back to Maggie's diner, but sometimes, on long, lonely drives, I think about that night, and I wonder if the man in the suit is still out there, waiting for the next tired traveler to stop by.
The sun was setting over the small Texas town of Maple Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. I had just moved into my new home, a quaint little house on the edge of town. The locals had been friendly enough, but there was something in their eyes, a flicker of unease, whenever they spoke to me. They kept warning me about something, but no one would say exactly what. It was always the same cryptic advice: be careful after dark, or don't wander too far from the main road. I brushed it off as small-town superstition, but as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things that I couldn't explain. The first strange occurrence happened about a week after I moved in. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the cool evening air, when I heard a faint whisper coming from the woods behind my house. It was so soft that I almost thought I imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded like a woman's voice, calling my name. I stood up and peered into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the rustling of leaves. I told myself it was just the wind, but the voice lingered in my mind, haunting me as I tried to fall asleep that night. The next day, I decided to explore the town a bit more. Black Hollow was a picturesque place, with its old-fashioned storefronts and charming town square, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I stopped by the local diner for lunch, and as I sat at the counter, I overheard a conversation between two elderly men at a nearby table. "You hear about the new girl in town?" one of them asked. "Yeah, the one who moved into the old Henderson place," the other replied. "Poor thing, she don't know what she's in for." I felt a chill run down my spine. They were talking about me. I wanted to ask them what they meant, but before I could, the waitress approached with my food, and the men fell silent. I ate quickly, my appetite gone, and left the diner with a growing sense of unease. That night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they grew more intense, until I could no longer pretend that they weren't real. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, determined to find the source of the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees at the edge of my property. As I scanned the area, I saw something move, a shadow darting between the trees. But my heart raced as I took a step closer, and then another, until I was standing at the edge of the woods. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, but the whispering stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, before turning back to the house. As I did, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure, standing just inside the tree line. I spun around, shining the light in that direction, but there was nothing there, just the empty forest. The next morning, I decided to visit the local library. If there was something strange going on in Black Hollow, maybe I could find some answers in the town's history. The librarian, a kind-looking woman named Mrs. Thompson, greeted me warmly as I entered. "Can I help you with something, dear?" she asked. "I was hoping to learn more about the history of Black Hollow," I replied. "I just moved here, and I'm curious about the town." Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, dear, we have a section on local history right over here." She led me to a small room at the back of the library, filled with old books and documents. I spent the next few hours poring over the materials, but there was little information about the town's early days. It was as if the history of Black Hollow had been erased, or deliberately hidden. The only thing I found was a mention of a series of disappearances that had occurred in the area over a century ago. Several people had vanished without a trace, and the cases were never solved. As I left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, but the streets were empty. Still, the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each step I took. By the time I reached my house, I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. I locked the doors and windows, trying to convince myself that I was safe, but the feeling of being watched never went away. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They were no longer just whispers, they were voices, calling to me from the woods. I tried to block them out, but they were impossible to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees as I made my way into the forest. The voices grew louder, more urgent, guiding me deeper into the woods. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old crumbling stone well. The voices seemed to be coming from inside it, was plaintively coming from inside it. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I peered over the edge, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of glowing red eyes, staring up at me from the darkness. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The eyes followed me, unblinking, as a low guttural growl emanated from the well. I turned and ran, not caring about the branches that scratched at my face, or the roots that threatened to trip me. I just ran, as fast as I could, until I burst out of the woods and into my backyard. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, and leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath.
The next morning, I went to the town sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Reynolds. I told him everything. The whispers, the figure in the woods, the eyes in the well. He listened patiently, but when I finished, he just shook his head. "Ma'am, I don't know what you saw, but there's nothing out there," he said. "Those woods have been empty for years." "But I saw something," I insisted. "I heard voices." "There's something in that well," Sheriff Reynolds sighed. "Look, I don't want to scare you, but folks around here have been telling stories about those woods for as long as I can remember. They say it's haunted, that there's something evil out there, but it's just stories, ma'am, nothing more." I left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated and more than a little scared. If no one would believe me, then I was on my own. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but as night fell, the whispers returned. This time they were accompanied by a low rhythmic drumming sound, like a heartbeat. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and louder, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with the sound. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and a kitchen knife, and I stepped outside. The drumming was coming from the woods, and I knew I had to face whatever was out there. I made my way to the clearing, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The well was still there, but now there was something else, a figure standing next to it. It was tall and thin, with long spindly limbs and glowing red eyes. It turned to face me, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I backed away, but it kept coming, until it was just a few feet away. I raised the knife, but before I could do anything, the figure lunged at me. I felt a cold, bony hand grip my arm, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground next to the well. The figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, lingering in the air. I got to my feet and stumbled back to the house, my mind racing. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay in Black Hollow any longer. The next morning, I packed my things and left, never looking back. But even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers calling to me from the woods, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel that cold, bony hand on my arm, pulling me back to the well. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's still out there, waiting, and one day, it will come for me again.
The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and makes your breath visible in little puffs of smoke. The woods stretched out before me, an endless sea of towering pines and gnarled oaks, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the pale gray sky. I had been hiking for hours, following a well-worn trail that snaked through the forest, but something had caught my eye, a narrow, almost invisible path veering off to the left. It was overgrown with ferns and thorny bushes, as if nature itself was trying to keep it hidden. A strange curiosity tugged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the main trail, but the pull was too strong. I stepped onto the hidden path. The first few minutes were uneventful. The trail was narrow, forcing me to duck under low-hanging branches and sidestep jagged rocks. The forest seemed quieter here, the usual chirping of birds replaced by an eerie silence. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But as I ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew heavier, damp and cold, clinging to my skin like a wet blanket. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks twisted and blackened, as if scorched by some long-forgotten fire. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the woods always felt different when you were alone. But then I saw it, a faint glimmer of light up ahead, It was soft and golden, flickering like a candle flame. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere? I hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. The light seemed to pulse, almost like it was beckoning me forward. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The trail opened up into a small clearing, and there, in the center, stood an old cabin. It was weathered and worn, its wooden planks warped and splintered with age. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were dark, their glass cracked and fogged. But what caught my attention was the door. It was slightly ajar, and from within, the golden light spilled out, casting long shadows across the ground. My stomach churned with unease, but I couldn't look away. Something about the cabin felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, like it had been plucked from another time and place and dropped into the woods. I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing at the threshold. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the silence was deafening. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing through the empty space. The interior was dimly lit, the golden light coming from a single lantern hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, each one cluttered with strange objects, jars filled with murky liquid, bundles of dried herbs, and what looked like animal bones. In the center of the room was a table, its surface scarred and stained, and on it lay a book. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and peeling. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in handwritten text that was faded and difficult to read. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the indentations left by the pen. The language was unfamiliar, a mix of symbols and letters that made no sense to me. But as I flipped through the pages, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense of dread, of something lurking just out of sight. I slammed the book shut and stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was coming from outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. I turned toward the door, my legs moving on their own, and stepped back outside. The clearing was empty, the trail leading back into the woods, just as I had left it. But the tapping continued, now coming from all around me. I spun in circles, trying to locate the source, but it was impossible. The sound was everywhere, and nowhere all at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, my chest heaving, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. I turned back toward the trail, but something caught my eye. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in a tattered cloak. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing and cold. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised a hand, its long bony fingers pointing toward the cabin, and then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside my window. I was in my bed, the sheets tangled around my legs. It had been a dream, just a dream. I let out a shaky breath and ran a hand through my hair. But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I noticed something, a faint golden light flickering in the corner of the room. My blood ran cold. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. There, on my dresser, was the book. The sun was setting as I drove down the narrow, cracked highway, the kind of road that seems to stretch endlessly into nowhere. My GPS had stopped working about 20 miles back, and the paper map I'd brought along was no help either. The town I was looking for wasn't marked on it. In fact, it wasn't marked on any map I could find, but I'd heard whispers of it, rumors of a place forgotten by time, a ghost town in Texas that no one talked about. And now, here I was, chasing those whispers. The sign appeared out of nowhere, rusted and leaning precariously to one side. It read, "Welcome to Black Hollow." The letters were barely legible, the paint chipped and faded. I slowed my car to a crawl as I passed it, the tires crunching over gravel and dried leaves. The air felt heavier here, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The trees on either side of the road were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I rolled down my window, and the scent of damp earth and decay wafted in. Black Hollow wasn't just a ghost town in the sense that it was abandoned. No, it felt like the town itself was a ghost, a spectral presence lingering in the middle of nowhere, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. The buildings were old, their wooden frames warped and sagging. The windows were dark, some shattered, others boarded up. The streets were empty, save for the occasional tumbleweed or scrap of paper blowing in the wind. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I parked my car in front of what looked like it might have once been a general store. The door hung open, creaking softly on its hinges. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was cool, but not uncomfortably so. It was the kind of cool that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter around yourself, not because you're cold, but because you feel like you should. The store was a mess inside. Shelves were overturned, their contents spilled across the floor. Dust covered everything, thick enough to write your name in. I shone my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. There were old cans of food, their labels faded and peeling. A cash register sat on the counter, its drawer hanging open, empty. In the corner, a rocking chair swayed gently, as if someone had just been sitting in it. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The chair stopped moving. I told myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped back outside, the door creaking behind me. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the town was bathed in twilight. I decided to explore a little more before it got too dark. The next building over was a saloon, its swinging doors hanging crookedly. Inside, the bar was still intact, bottles of liquor lined up behind it. The stools were overturned, and a deck of cards was scattered across one of the tables. I picked up a card, the ace of spades. It felt cold in my hand, unnaturally so. As I walked further into the town, I noticed something strange. The buildings seemed to shift when I wasn't looking at them directly. I'd glance at a house, and when I looked back, it was slightly closer than before. The streets seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. It was as if the town was alive, rearranging itself to keep me trapped. I heard a sound then, a soft rhythmic tapping. It was coming from one of the houses. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was small, its porch sagging under the weight of years. The tapping was coming from inside. I climbed the steps, each one creaking under my weight. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The tapping stopped. The inside of the house was dim, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the floorboards were warped and uneven. I shone my flashlight around, the beam catching on something in the corner. It was a music box, its lid open. The ballerina inside was broken, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I reached out to touch it, and the music started playing, a slow, haunting melody that sent a chill down my spine. I turned to leave,
but the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The room was suddenly freezing, my breath visible in the air. The music box was still playing, the melody growing louder. I could hear whispers now, faint and indistinct, coming from all around me. I backed up against the wall, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could make out words now, my name. They were saying my name. I don't know how I got out of that house. One moment I was trapped, the next I was running down the street, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. The town was darker now, the shadows deeper. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the windows of the buildings. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the town far behind me. I pulled over to catch my breath, my hands still trembling. That's when I noticed something on the passenger seat. It was the music box, its lid closed. I didn't remember bringing it with me. I reached out to touch it, but before I could, the lid popped open, and the ballerina began to turn, the haunting melody filling the car. I threw the music box out the window and drove away, not looking back. But even now, miles away from Black Hollow, I can still hear the whispers. They're faint, but they're there, calling my name. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the town, the twisted trees, the sagging buildings, the empty streets. It's waiting for me. I know it is, and one day, I'll have to go back.
The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the endless aisles of Walmart. It was my first night on the job, and the store was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, the hum of the freezers, the creak of the floorboards, the distant echo of your own footsteps. I adjusted my blue vest and glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Only 13 minutes until my shift officially started. I was already regretting taking this job. The Walmart was in the middle of nowhere, a small town called Black Hollow that barely showed up on maps. The town had a population of maybe 1,500 people, and most of them were either too old or too tired to shop late at night. That's why the night shift was always skeleton crew, just me, my manager, Carl, and a security guard named Roy, who looked like he hadn't slept since the 80s. Carl had given me a quick rundown of the rules before he left for the night. Rule number 1, he said, his voice low and serious. Never go to the back storage room after midnight. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, stay out of there. Rule number 2, if you hear a child laughing, ignore it. There are no kids in the store after 10 p.m. Rule number 3, if the intercom comes on by itself, don't respond. Just keep working. And rule number 4, change name of town from Black Hollow to something more unique. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the endless aisles of Walmart. It was my first night on the job, and the store was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, the hum of the freezers, the creak of the floorboards, the distant echo of your own footsteps. I adjusted my blue vest and glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Only 13 minutes until my shift officially started. I was already regretting taking this job. The Walmart was in the middle of nowhere, a small town called Crimson Vale that barely showed up on maps. The town had a population of maybe 1,500 people, and most of them were either too old or too tired to shop late at night. That's why the night shift was always skeleton crew, just me, my manager, Carl, and a security guard named Roy, who looked like he hadn't slept since the 80s. Carl had given me a quick rundown of the rules before he left for the night. Rule number 1, he said, his voice low and serious. Never go to the back storage room after midnight. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, stay out of there. Rule number 2, if you hear a child laughing, ignore it. There are no kids in the store after 10 p.m. Rule number 3, if the intercom comes on by itself, don't respond, just keep working. And rule number 4, if you see someone standing at the end of an aisle who doesn't belong there, don't make eye contact. Walk away and call me immediately. I laughed nervously at the time, thinking Carl was just messing with the new guy, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. Crimson Vale had a reputation, he said. People whispered about it in nearby towns, but no one ever talked about it openly. There were stories about disappearances, strange lights in the woods, and a history that no one liked to revisit. The Walmart, apparently, was no exception. The first few hours of my shift were uneventful. I stocked shelves, organized the toy aisle, and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that settled in my chest. The store was too big, too empty, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Roy was patrolling the perimeter, his flashlight cutting through the darkness every now and then. I could hear his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor, but I rarely saw him. It was almost like he was avoiding me. At around 1:30 a.m., I heard it for the first time, a faint high-pitched laughter coming from somewhere deep in the store. It sounded like a child, but it was distorted, like it was being played through a broken speaker. My blood ran cold, and I froze mid-step, clutching a box of cereal to my chest. Carl's words echoed in my mind. If you hear a child laughing, ignore it. There are no kids in the store after 10 p.m. I forced myself to keep moving, but the laughter followed me. It seemed to bounce off the walls, coming from every direction at once. I turned down the cereal aisle, and there, at the far end, stood a figure. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was facing away from me, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I remembered Carl's 4th rule: if you see someone standing at the end of an aisle who doesn't belong there, don't make eye contact. Walk away and call me immediately. I turned on my heel and walked as fast as I could without running, my heart pounding in my ears. The laughter grew louder, more manic, and I could hear footsteps behind me, light, quick, and getting closer. I ducked into the break room and slammed the door shut, leaning against it as I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial Carl's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tense. There's something in the store," I stammered. "A kid, or something that looks like a kid. It's following me." Carl was silent for a moment. "Did you make eye contact?" "No." "Good. Stay in the break room. Don't come out until I get there." Carl arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say much, just handed me a flashlight and told me to stick close to him. We searched the store together, but there was no sign of the figure or the laughter. Everything was quiet again, too quiet. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," Carl said as we walked back to the break room. "The store, it's built on land that used to be part of an old asylum. They tore it down in the 50s, but some people say the patients never really left. They just moved underground." I stared at him, trying to decide if he was serious. "You're joking, right?" Carl shook his head. "I wish I was. That's why we have the rules. They're not just for show, they're to keep you safe." The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. By the time my shift ended at 7 a.m., I was exhausted,
both physically and mentally. As I walked out to my car, I noticed something scratched into the side of the building. It was faint, almost invisible, unless you were looking for it, but it was there. A series of symbols that looked like they'd been carved into the concrete with a knife. I didn't know what they meant, but they sent a chill down my spine. I got into my car and drove home. The image of those symbols burned into my mind. I didn't know if I'd last another night at the Crimson Vale Walmart, but one thing was certain: I'd never look at the night shift the same way again. The next night, I came back. I told myself it was because I needed the money, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something about the store, something that drew me in, even as it terrified me. And as the nights went on, I began to uncover more of its secrets, secrets that were better left buried. But that's a story for another time.